Bedtime was her favorite time. The woman loved going to bed. The woman was Lainey. Lainey was pretty ordinary. In almost every way, she was ordinary. She lived in the middle, not too high, not too low, in the middle. She wasn't young, but she wasn't old yet. She was not too tall, not too short, not too small. She was round. Not great big and round, just round. Round face, round lips, round eyes, round breasts, round hips, and a beautiful, big, beautiful, round African butt. She was lucky. I didn't get that. But Lainey didn't think there was anything beautiful about her. In all her life, only her mother had called her beautiful. Once, maybe twice. And her mother was gone, had been gone for 6 years, 8 months, 9 days. She was devastated to lose her mother. Lainey's mother had been her world, her whole world. Lainey's mother was a chatterbox, a rainbow of a woman. When she laughed, it was like blowing bubbles. It hung in the air. Lainey didn't have to talk when her mother was around. Her mother could just look at her and tell whatever it was Lainey needed. Mommy's voice was a soundtrack, and Lainey moved and grooved to its rhythm and melody. Without her mother taking up space, everything seemed empty. Right after losing her, Lainey pretended to be her. When you live by yourself, you can do crazy stuff like that. She took the memory of her mother and she tried it on. The laughter, the brightness of language, the bigness of spirit. She tried it on and she fell flat. It just made her sadder, more alone, words echoing back at herself. She found it impossible to sleep. Alone at night, she would wallow in her grief. Listening to the darkest blues, watching herself cry in the mirror. Even blues songs offer glimmers of hope, but Lainey heard none of that. She cried until she was blinded by her tears. She would get in bed without bothering to get out of her clothes, tossing and turning all night. Her exhaustion threatened to tear apart her already dwindling world. Well, that's how it was with her before she sculpted her nightly ritual. One night, she remembered how her mother used to read to her. And she found a book that she remembered her mother holding and actually reading, a book of poems, and she read it. Reading surrounded her with memories of her mother. It felt good. So she got another book. She found a book that her mother would never read in front of her. It was a book of sexy stories. It tickled her to think of mommy reading something like this. She read it. When she finished, she searched the house, and just as she thought, her mother had quite a collection of erotica. Lainey quickly went through that collection and added books of her own. She took to reading these sexy literature every night before going to bed. Turned out to be a pleasing diversion. Y'all know what I'm talking about. It soon became physical. It inspired her. Inspired her to reach inside of herself and massage that soft sexiness she found there. Well, for a while, she found relief in this practice. She found relief in sound sleep. Going to bed became the most soothing part of her day. She started celebrating bedtime, buying sexy lingerie, listening to sexy music, reading sexy stories. This led to her building her own sexual fantasies. She had a thing for Samuel Jackson. You know, he's a brilliant actor, but sex symbol? But he starred in a lot of her fantasies. And this was wonderful. For a while, for years. She satisfied herself this way. Then one day, one night, after years, it got old. Satisfying herself was not enough. She wanted to talk to someone who cared about her, and then have that someone touch her. But she didn't know anybody who cared. The only person who had cared for her genuinely was gone. And to see her again was all she wished for. Even if it were in her dreams, if she could just see her mother's face. Lainey prayed to dream of her mother. She fell asleep thinking of her. But instead of dreaming of her mother, in her dream, she stood on the bank of a raging river. She stood there knowing somehow she must cross it. She looked about wondering where she was and why she was there. Then she saw a village behind her. It looked deserted, but she knew people were hiding because she could feel their fear, and they were more afraid than she was. She stood there knowing that she had to cross the river for them. She ran to the river, running past her fear, diving down into the waters. Cold, deep, angry, rushing water. Well, rushing water riptides that threatened to suck her away. But she, with no fear, claimed the deep, claimed the cold, claimed the angry. Swirling in its whirlpool, feeling the flow, first knowing, then slowing the rage of the river, her heart on fire with purpose. She warmed and calmed the waters. She became the river. She woke up with a start. She had become a river? Why that dream and not a dream of mommy? Growing up, her mother had read folk and fairy tales to her, and their favorites had been the quest tales. Her mother would often ask, why is it that boys always get to slay the dragons? And she would read the story over and make the boy a girl. Maybe mommy was somewhere in that dream. Shrugging her shoulders and getting out of bed, she said out loud, I hope it was good for the village. Lainey put on her clothes, jeans and a sweatshirt. She rebraided the small crown of braids atop her head. She went to the factory, worked a double. It wasn't unusual. She came home, she cooked her dinner. In fact, she cooked enough dinner to feed a gang of folks. The longer she stayed in the kitchen, the more she liked it. Her mother had been a good cook, and she had taught Lainey everything she knew. Lainey loved how it felt to cook. She loved how her hands felt when preparing food. She delighted in the tasting. The textures, ooh, that was her favorite. Mushy, crumbly, slimy, crunchy, gooey, sticky, soupy, scaly, slick, and slippery. She loved how it felt like her fingers were tasting the food by touching it. She loved the smells cooking created and the heat it generated. In the kitchen, Lainey was quick and decisive, her rhythm constant. In the kitchen, she was at ease. In the kitchen, she was her mother's equal. They often cooked together and invited mommy's friends over to eat. Mommy had lots of friends. And they didn't mind Lainey. She was so quiet, you barely knew she was there. They were happy, like Lainey, to be near enough to the mother to hear her stories, to hear her observations, to see her impressions, to be sprinkled with her laughter while eating good food that they often paid for. The mother was all that. And she was all Lainey had. Her father had died when she was a baby. He lived in the stories from the mother. And these stories were special because, like the act of cooking, Mommy only shared these stories with Lainey. She would say, Your father was big, with big, rough hands, and an even bigger, soft heart. Yes, his hands were rough, but his touch, tender. She said her words thick with love. He was a kind, sweet, shy man. He was my big, kind, sweet, gentle man. Oh, I miss him. I miss him so. He didn't talk much. He didn't have much to say, but that smile of his opened my heart. His smile was like a poem, a love poem, just for me. It's true. He only smiled for me. And that smile, did something to me. Your daddy was my heart. I swear he was. Mama lifted her side and lifted her hands in the air to testify. And there will never be another one like him. Not for me. You know, he was bigger than me. But he always said that I required more room than him. Whatever that means. Lainey knew what it meant. She felt it too. Anyway, the mother said, ending the story for that day, he lived quietly and carefully, not wanting to be noticed, just like you, Lainey. True enough. But if Lainey had wanted to talk more, wanted to reach out more, she would have had to push, fight for that space, because her mother's presence was so big, it didn't leave much room. Now she sat alone in the kitchen that she once shared with her mother, so it didn't matter about her not having the room. There was nobody there to take up the room. She sat in that kitchen alone, eating a small plate of fancy food that she had fixed for herself. Eating fast because eating alone only reminded her how lonely she was. Leftover food already packed up, ready to go. She had done that before she sat down to eat. Tomorrow on her way to work, she would drop it off at the homeless shelter. The man there, Wilson, who managed the kitchen, he was always happy to get Lainey's food. Well, he was probably happy to get anybody's food, she thought. But maybe, just maybe, her food was special. If she wasn't, maybe her food was special. Quickly and quietly, she cleaned the kitchen. At least her hands did. Her mind was still on Wilson, the man at the shelter. Looked a little bit like Samuel, except he had a pot belly. She thought about how kind he seemed. Then she dressed herself for bed in her prettiest lingerie. Looking at herself in the mirror, she, still thinking of the man, almost smiled, but she didn't. She kept her round lips in a straight line most of the time. She was round and soft, perfect for bed. Perfect if she ever wrapped herself around somebody in bed. She never did. She didn't even know what that felt like. In all her years, she had only had sex 2 times, and neither time had been in a bed. Is that hard to believe? It all started when she was in high school. The first time she laid with a man was in high school. Well, he really wasn't a man. It was more like a boy. Yeah, really, a boy. It started with her sitting quietly with girls she thought to be her friends. But these girls laughed more often at her than with her. Karen had been her kinda, sorta friend in high school. You see, Karen's mother was a friend of Laney's mother, and hoping to please Laney's mother, Karen's mother had asked her daughter, who went to school with Laney, to take that pitifully shy girl under your wing. And Karen, hoping to stay in her mother's good graces, agreed. But she had no love for Laney, and she made that clear to her other good friends. So Laney was at the table, but she wasn't offered true friendship. Most often, she was the guest of honor at a pity party. Then there was Jeff. Jeff was Karen's boyfriend. But Laney worried him so. Her roundness worried him. Thoughts of being cushioned by it, of submerging himself in it, plagued him. Every time he saw Laney, her African butt worried him. When he saw her, he just wanted to cup some of that roundness in his hands. He also noticed how Laney yearned for acceptance, how she wanted to be accepted. He saw Laney's longing as weakness. It was obvious to him that Laney desperately wanted a friend. And it occurred to him that if he gave her a taste of what she wanted, he might get all of what he wanted. And he set about accomplishing that goal. It started with kind words, quiet smiles. Jeff was patient, working his plan step by step. She was nervous whenever he was around. But he could tell she enjoyed his attention, and he was careful only to give it when nobody would notice. Finally, she began to think of him as a friend, and he knew he could get her alone at last. He invited her to movie night at his house. She went because he said that Karen and the others were coming, of course. But when she got to his house, he let her know right away they were completely alone. Even his parents were gone. Ooh, she was afraid, but she stayed because she was excited too. He stood in front of her. She could smell him. The mint on his breath, the cologne he had splashed on. She breathed him in, and his scent held her there. Then he was holding her there, but not by force, by wrapping his arms around her, squeezing her close, and telling her how good she felt to him. "Oh, you feel good," he said. But she stuttered. You are Karen's boyfriend." He nuzzled her neck licked at her ears and said, "I don't want her. I want you," he breathed in her ear. Ooh. Lainey wasn't ready for this. Her legs felt like water. And just as she thought she was going to turn into a puddle, Jeff pulled her to the couch and acted out all his round fantasies. At first, she only received him, not giving anything back. But what he was given got so good to her, she couldn't keep it. She couldn't keep still. She couldn't keep quiet. She couldn't keep herself from opening up more and more and more until she wasn't Lainey anymore and he wasn't Jeff anymore. They were something else, something rolling, something quaking, something blazing. Together they were magnificent. Yes, magnificent. She felt glorious and she screamed. It was her first time. She had no idea that she could feel this way. It was her first time and she felt so good that she screamed. Now, it wasn't Jeff's first time. However, in his young life, he had never had sex like this. He had exploded, but then she screamed, and it scared him. I told you he was a boy. He pushed her away, trying to get out of all that softness. He was engulfed by her softness, the very thing he thought he wanted. Now it was too much. He tried to pry himself out of her arms, but she clung to him. Finally, he yelled at her, "What's wrong with you? Let go of me!" His yelling and pushing brought her back to herself. "Why did you scream like that?" he sneered. "You're not hurt, are you?" She didn't know what to say. A moment ago, she had felt incredible, magnificent, glorious. Now, everything hurt. The way he was looking at her hurt. The air in the room on her half-dressed body, suddenly cold, hurt. The way she wanted him to hold her again so bad, it hurt. Lainey opened her mouth to speak, but couldn't think of what to say. Then she felt water dripping on her breast, and she realized she was crying. "You want me to walk you home or something?" Jeff spat the question at her. As she pulled on her skirt and picked up her panties, she rushed by him, shaking her head and pulling her blouse closed. In front of his house, on the street in front of his house, she noticed two girls from school, and they noticed her. Jeff saw them and closed the door quickly. The next day, yeah, it was all over school. Ooh, Karen let that pitiful fool Lainey be her friend, and Lainey paid her back by screwing her man, Jeff. Secretly, Karen was relieved. Relieved. Now she could openly act on her contempt for Lainey. Surely her mother would not expect her to continue to be friends with a slut. Lainey barely made it on campus that morning before Karen and the girls caught up with her. They beat her down in front of the whole school. It had rained the night before, so the ground was muddy. Karen pushed her down in the mud and then stood over her and said, "You didn't fool nobody. You always been a hoe, and now you a muddy hoe." Muddy hoe, they laughed. Muddy hoe, they called her. By the end of the day, they had shortened it to mud. They laughed at her because she got up from the mud and went to the restroom and washed her face and hands, but continued to go to class in her mud-streaked clothes. Didn't she have sense enough to go home? Mud sure was stupid. Karen pounded her a couple more times that day. Once in front of Jeff, who pulled Karen away saying, "Don't get yourself in trouble over that freak." Freak? Freak? By the time she got home, she was almost catatonic. Her mother looked at her and she wouldn't speak, she just shivered. Her mother couldn't get a word out of her. She shivered. Her mother bathed her, hugged her, held her, rocked her until her baby finally broke down in tears. Sputtering the story, a word here, a phrase there. It took 2 whole days before Mommy found out or got the clear picture of what had happened. Lainey refused to go back to school, saying she didn't want to be called names. Her mother said, "Well, it doesn't matter what they call you. You know who you are." Lainey muttered under her breath, "I might be what they're calling me." "What?" "Maybe I'm what they're calling me." I knew he was Karen's boyfriend, and I still wanted to do what we did. I liked it. Mommy, I liked it. So maybe I am a whore. Her mother put her hands on her hips and said, "Even whores need education. Get back to that school and slay them dragons, girl. Slay them dragons." But Lainey wouldn't. She couldn't. She felt like she was the dragon, and she had been slain, never to rise again. She told her mother, "Well, you know, I only have 1 more year left, and if I'm going to go work in the factory like Daddy did, I don't need that extra year. That's been my plan all along, to work in the factory just like my father." It hadn't been her plan. It became her plan because she didn't want to go back and face them at school. After a while, her mother stopped pushing her to go back. Might be a blessing for Lainey to work. The mother could never keep a steady job. Few months at best. She was always changing jobs. Jobs required her to restrict herself too much, and she was far more expansive than that. So Lainey went to work at the factory and took care of her mother just like her father had. She took care of the chatterbox, the rainbow woman, the bubbles of laughter. Lainey took care of her mother because she needed her. And now, years later, standing in the mirror in her prettiest nightgown, she still needed her. Lainey prayed again that night to dream of her mother and fell asleep. This time, she found herself at the foot of a steep mountain. Cold wind whipped at her clothes. She looked down, and she was still in her nightgown. Snow falling softly. Even though a cold wind blew, the snowfall fell softly, dusting her skin with silvery glitter. She looked behind her and saw the river, now calmly lapping against the bank. Just beyond the river, she saw the village. This time, somebody was standing in the middle of it, standing alone. It was her. She was standing alone in the village crying. It hurt her to see herself that way. She quickly turned away and faced the mountain again. The mountain shielded in ice. Laughed at Lainey. The wind sighed. The mountain. Impossible to climb. Ice. Impossible to climb the ice. Legs lifting, arms pulling, grasping. She heard her cries coming from the village. She must try. Slipping under her hands, the mountain sliding under her legs. This time, the wind spoke and pushed her down and away. Snow whispered, "Look up." She looked up. Looked up enough to try to find cracks in the wall of rock. No, look up higher, to the top. To the top. The wind pushing her. But she kept her eyes on the top of the mountain. No matter how hard the wind pushed or how fast she slid, she struggled to keep her eyes on the top. Snow whispered, fell under her, helping her to keep her head up. She willed her heart to follow her eyes. Follow her eyes. Follow her eyes to the top. The snow whispered, "Look. Look." Her eyes still on the top. She struggled to keep her head up, for her heart to follow her eyes. She willed her heart to follow her eyes. Then she flies. Then she flies. She flies. flies to the top of the mountain. Lainey came out of that dream like she was flung through a portal. What was that about, she thought. She flew to the top of the mountain. She should feel better. She should feel stronger. But all she felt was shaken. She had seen herself in the village, and she was dressed as she had been dressed on the day her mother died. That image brought back all the pain. It reminded her that she was alone in life. But it had not always been that way. She hadn't always kept her round lips in a straight line. There was a time when she smiled into her mother's eyes while being wrapped in her mother's loving arms. Those arms had made the pain go away time after time after time. The day she discovered her mother dead on the steps of their back porch, she lost that sanctuary. She lost that safe place. She lost everything. Her mother had fallen that morning and had laid there dying all day. Where had the mother's friends been that day? If only she had been at home. But she had to work. She had to work. On the day Mommy needed Lainey, she had not been there. Yes, she worked, but she had not come home right after work. If only she had. She had spent time with a man that day, Freddie. She gave Freddie, a coworker, a ride home. Freddie had big, rough hands, maybe like her father's, she remembered thinking as she watched, as she looked at them. He caught her staring at his hands and while they worked, and he was embarrassed, and he said he knew his hands were big and ugly, and Lainey quickly said they were nice hands. This surprised him. His smile was sudden and big. Nobody ever told me that, he said. Him smiling at her felt good. She wanted to smile back or say something, but smiling didn't come easy, and she couldn't think of what to say. Opening her mouth and closing it slowly into a straight line was all she could manage. They both stood there silently for a moment. Then Freddie stepped closer, looking in her eyes, and when Lainey didn't back away, he stepped closer still, and he asked if she could give him a ride home. Without opening her mouth, she nodded. On the day her mother died, she worked overtime. She worked overtime because Freddie worked overtime and he needed a ride. She hated thinking about this part, but it all came back to her. Before he got out of the car, he touched her with his hands. His big, rough hands were beautiful to Lainey. And she wanted him to handle her with those hands, and he did. With his soft lips, his full mouth, he explored the up and down of her. He pushed and pulled at her, moaned and groaned on her until he hit a rhythm with her. Not too fast, not too slow. A rhythm. And she was with him. They were in it. Together they moved in sync with one another. A rocking, a groove that led to pleasure, pure. Her rejoicing wanted to take the form of a scream, but this time she caught it, squeezed it into a moan, placed it in his mouth. It became something that passed back and forth in that rhythm. Not too fast, not too slow. They passed it back and forth until a mutual eruption smoldered and then cooled. All of this in her car on a side street. He didn't explain why they couldn't go to his house. She didn't ask. He said, pull over. She did. She knew he didn't care beyond her flesh, and it hadn't mattered. Her need to feel his hands on her in that moment was enough. Driving by herself home, she wondered how she was going to share this with Mommy. She knew Mommy would know there was something to share. And this didn't bother her. It comforted her. It was only the second time she'd been with a man, and she needed to understand what it meant. She needed her mother to make sense of it all. But that didn't happen. Mommy was gone. Lainey remembered how her world shifted and shattered, how she cracked, threatened to break into little tiny pieces. Ashamed and afraid that all would see how broken she was. Realizing that no one knew her enough. No one cared enough to reach her, to help her. Not wanting to feel the unbearable pressure of pity, she pretended to go forward with her life. But really, she was walking in place. To keep from falling down, from giving up, from fading away, she found a rhythm. A rhythm, not too fast, not too slow. A rhythm that could pass for living. A rhythm, she searched for it. A rhythm that could pass. A rhythm, she held on to it. A rhythm that could pass for living. A rhythm passing for living. Passing for living. All of that came rushing back to her when she saw that image of herself in the village, in the middle of the village, crying in the middle of her dream. What were these dreams? What did they mean? Slowly she put her clothes on. She didn't bother to do her hair. And she went to work, to the factory. She tried to lose herself in the work. Work that made her back ache, her hands cramp. Work that brought her no joy. Work that was steady. Steady work. The time clock became her drum pulse. It seemed to pound from within her, counting off the days of her life. But she wasn't living. She wasn't living, but it was counting off the days of her life as she worked at being ordinary, worked at not standing out. This part wasn't hard. It was her nature to slip by unnoticed. It was her protection. You see, all those years ago, after her mother died, Freddie had asked for more rides home. But she said, no, never again. That's when he shared the news. He shared the news of how much fun she could be in a parked car. Freddie called her a freak. Then he laughed and said he meant that in a good way. Freddie must have thought he was a very good storyteller because he told he and Lainey's story over and over and over. After that, she grew even more quiet than before, barely speaking, eating alone, but working harder than anyone. Now she was silent, not angry, not sad, silent. From time to time, she still got men asking for rides home, or could she take lunch with them in the parking lot? So quiet and alone at work seemed safe. Better safe than sorry, right? But she was sorry to be living like this. Her facade was chipping away. Her mask was dissolving. Lainey worried that crazy might peek through any moment. That night she was afraid to go to sleep. The dreams had renewed her pain, made it fresh. She wanted no more. She no longer prayed to dream of her mother. She prayed long and hard for peace, sleep with no dreams. But when sleep came, so did her dream. She opened her eyes. She was standing on top of the mountain. From here, the view of the river and the village were splendid. A gentle breeze caressed her skin and seemed to make all things peaceful. She was just about to whisper a prayer of thanks when a dark shadow rose up behind her, covering the land. Then a hissing sound. She whirled around and she found herself staring into the gold-green glittering eyes of a dragon. A fire-breathing dragon. The dragon, scaly, green, monstrous, lowered its head and glared into her eyes. Looking into the eyes of that dragon, she felt fight rise up in her. The dragon licked its lips, licked its tongue at her, wanting to taste her fear, but there was none. Lainey stood her ground. The dragon, turning its head from side to side, wondering why he couldn't smell the fear or taste it. She was fluid. As she moved this way, she moved that way. She was fluid because she knew how to become a river. The dragon decided to stop playing and then roared his breath of fire at her. But she became water and turned to steam. Surprised the dragon. The dragon stepped back, then whipped his tail at her, but she was steam, hot steam. He howled. She knew she had hurt him. She liked the sound of his cry. She could feel the dragon, as though some part of him was her. She knew he wanted to flee. So she embedded herself first on his scaly body. Her hands grabbed hold and she pulled at the scale, peeling away until she embedded herself in his throat. She was in the dragon. Still no fear. Still no fear. Nothing but fight. Oh, it was too late. The dragon wanted to fly away, but she wouldn't let him, because he would only come back to terrorize her another day. Inside the dragon, she expanded. She felt the dragon trying to close in on her, squeeze her out, but she wouldn't let him. Embedded in, she expanded. She expanded. Feeling him, knowing him, understanding him. He lifted his wings, but to no avail. He was too heavy with Lainey inside of him. She grew bigger. Her arms, her legs bigger, her head bigger, her heart bigger. The dragon didn't have a chance. She would go nowhere. Nowhere. She grew so big that she burst. And she stood on the mountaintop, victorious. The dragon, a steamy pile behind her. Her nightgown flowing in the breeze like a cape of a superhero. So this is how it feels to be strong. She felt golden, as though the sun was shining through her. Suddenly, she heard cheering from the village. People dancing, laughing, chanting her name. Lainey, 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 you saved us. Lainey, 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 you saved us. Sounded like a hit record to her. Lainey, 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 you saved us. She could hear them clearly, but she couldn't make out who they were. She looked, she squinted. They were all women. She still couldn't make out their faces. Then she remembered, she could fly. So she glided on the wind over the river and landed in the middle of the cheering women. When she landed there, she was shocked. All the women were her. All of them were her. Some were her girl self, but most of them were women that she was. Each one making her see a different point in her life. They looked exactly like her, dressed as she had been dressed on each occasion, except they were all smiling. Lenny had never smiled when she'd been these women. They weren't just smiling. Their eyes shone with joy. They were happy. They were her, and they were happy. The women rushed to her, laying their hands on her and chanting, "Lainey, Lainey, we love you. We love you." She felt electric, energized by their joy and their love. All the Laneys started jumping for joy. They looked like a tribe of Maasai, up and down. And Laney, the dragon slayer, was jumping the highest to the rhythm. "We love you. We love you. We love you." She woke jumping on her bed. Jumping and singing out loud, "You saved us. You saved us. We love you." When she realized that she was awake, she stopped jumping. Whoa. She didn't sit down, though. She stood there like a superhero, standing on her bed because she felt like she had done something. She felt different. She jumped off her bed and ran to the mirror. And what she saw there made her laugh. Made her laugh like bubbles. Her crown of braids had come undone. Her hair was standing up all over her head, but she looked good. Her round brown eyes twinkled with laughter. A sparkling smile stretched across her face, lighting the pretty details of it. She spoke to the mirror as though it was someone else. What happened? How did I get here? I feel strong. I feel happy. What happened? She waited as though she was waiting for an answer. After a moment, she turned from the mirror and spoke to the house. "It was me. I saved me. I delivered me. I rescued me. I shook off the sadness. Who knew? Who knew I could do that? I did it. I slayed the dragon." Maybe the dragon was me. Whatever, I'm not going back to investigate. Whatever this is, I want it. I want to keep it. I feel worthy. I feel like I deserve to be happy. I'm happy. And just then her alarm went off on her phone, signaling that it was time to get up and go back to the factory. Dread, like a dark cloud, started to hover. She ran to the phone and clicked off the alarm first, and then opened the phone, dialing her supervisor at the factory. Mr. Anderson, this is Lainey, and I'm not coming in today, she said without taking a breath. And then she added, or tomorrow. Yep, I'm sick. Yep, I'll be sick tomorrow. Yep, I'm sure. Okay, goodbye. She clicked off that call and began to dial another one. Good morning. Can I have the kitchen, please? Thank you. Wilson came on the line. Hello? She dropped the phone. She looked at the phone and she told herself, this is a small thing. You have everything you need to get it done. It's not a dragon. She picked up the phone, struck her superhero pose, and found her voice. She let her honest desire to know him rush through the phone and curl around his heart. A heart that had been waiting for her to crack the door open enough so it could squeeze itself into her world. She invited Wilson to dinner. He said, sure, but could he come early to help her cook? She laughed like bubbles and said, okay, sure. And then, hanging up the phone, still smiling, she cut on her music and jumped for joy. Anyway, the storyteller said, ending the story for that day, she lived happily ever